Hello. Hello, I'm Holly Elissa, and I welcome you too, trauma survivors walking each other home. I'm always glad to be with you. It's been 4 years now. Initially, the program was entitled Happiness is Running Through the Streets to Find You, translating trauma's harsh legacy into healing. And when I began to have other people on with me regularly, it was called Two Trauma Survivors Helping Each Other Find Our Way Home. And today it's just me, and I'm glad about that. And today's a special day. I'm glad about being with friends too, but I'm glad to be with you solo. There's much to connect with you about and to invite you to consider. And today is that special eclipse day. Oh my goodness, it's the 8th of April, 2024. I live in Massachusetts. I have friends who've gone up to Vermont to be in the spectrum of being able to see the eclipse. I have a friend from California who flew to oh my gosh, where did she go? Southern Texas to see the eclipse. I'm trying to think of where she went, but it's obviously a very smart place to go to see the eclipse. And how about you? Is the eclipse affecting you? I remember reading in Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee, I think, about how the eclipse could really affect people's psyches. And how could it not? How could it not? And so when we have major events like an eclipse or an earthquake, one of those was just in what, Bridgeton, New Jersey. And people looked up and saw their chandeliers shake and said, "What's going on here?" Or perhaps, oh my goodness, we've all seen tsunamis, people who are on holiday in Phuket, in the Southeast Asia, and all of a sudden, that's the old way to say it, not all of a sudden, but of a sudden, things really change, and this kind of a darkness comes over, kind of a special, poignant, turgid energy comes over us. And I'm just reminded of animals. Most of us know and have heard that what an animal will do is move to safety. Move to safety. So if a tsunami is coming, an animal will start climbing. How wise, yes? There was a church song, a children's song I learned in Sunday school. My very Calvinistic, born again. God bless them. No problem with that. Just wasn't for me. But if it's for you, I'm glad it is working for you. I am. And so I was raised with the rain comes down and the flood comes up. The rain comes down and the flood comes up. The rain flood comes down and the flood comes up. And the house on the sand went. Foolish man built his house upon the sand. Foolish man built his house upon the sand. Excuse my voice. Foolish man built his house upon the sand, and the rains came tumbling down. Wise man, because we don't have a foolish man, house went flat. Wise man built his house upon the rock. Wise man. Wise man built his house upon the rock. Wise man built his house upon the rock. Wise man built his house upon the rock, and the house on the rock stood firm. That is the theme for today, my friends. It's a very intuitive theme. I'm going to try to hold it together, and I will develop it with you. Because my question is this: when, as trauma survivors, and if you're not a trauma survivor, when you're with a trauma survivor, and 1 out of every 3 women has been sexually abused, so chances are high, if you're with other women, that somebody like me is a trauma survivor. And a lot of times, if you work with children learn that classic: don't you dare talk with anybody outside the family. Don't you trust anybody outside the family. Of course, 8 people in the family are doing the harm generally when it comes to violence. And 3, don't trust, don't talk, don't trust. And 3 is don't feel. Don't have any feelings for yourself. And those are the ways to stay safe. And why are they the ways to stay safe? Because they're the ways to dissociate. And dissociation, as you know, is not feeling where I am. It's being out of touch with my body. It's letting my body fend for itself. And when I was a survivor of molestation, I would, I was going to say sound simple, but it wasn't. I couldn't bear staying in my body. And it was just too unbearable that a member of my family could be doing something to me that was so violative. Usually at night, and I couldn't scream out. I couldn't say a thing. And so I would leave my body and I would envision myself climbing, flying in a way. I had no gravity at that point, of course, left my body's gravity behind, and I climbed out through the window, up above the rooftops, up to the moon. And if it were a sliver of a moon, I could sit on it and rest for a while. And my goal was to get to heaven. How many of you were told as a child, if you go to heaven, everything's wonderful, nothing hurts at all? That's Kurt Vonnegut. Vonnegut, everything is beautiful, nothing hurts at all. And that was the promise that I felt inside of me. I hadn't heard those words. I felt that promise inside of me as a child. If I could just go to where the angels are, to where people are playing harps and lyres, and people will be very happy to be with me, and the pearly gates will open wide, and everything's in pastel. Honey, it's this beautiful sunrise, pink and purple, or a sunset, flaming tangerine. It's just beautiful up there. It's like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. There's a lot of beauty up there, right? When you're off to see the wizard. So here's the thing. When we are alone as trauma survivors, and when we feel off base, perhaps due to an illness, perhaps due to an outside event that is troubling us, perhaps due to just a switch in internal chemistry, like being hungry, like being a diabetic and knowing, oh my gosh, I've got to keep my insulin level up. Yeah, there could be a lot that's going on. And my question to you is this: what can a trauma survivor do when he or she feels that things are beyond her control, that something's going on, that something's not comfortable going on? And the automatic response is the fear response. And as we've discussed many times, if you've been with me, if not, I'll just say it out loud. The fear response means that my body goes into a panic attack, panic state, and says, girl, this is not a safe environment. You must save yourself, because survival is above all the most important thing. So it's not safe where you are. It's not safe to be with the people you're with. It's not safe to be in that place. If I were a goat and I felt in my being, in my bones, that a tsunami was coming, I'd start clambering up the hill. Cows know where to go during thunderstorms. Sheep know where to go. And we have guide dogs that guide sheep about where to go. And so what is our internal compass? What's our true north? When we're alone and something uncomfortable happens either from the outside or the inside, and we know now as trauma survivors that what's going to happen is our brains are going to go to 10 to 5% of consciousness, our executive functions, the parts of us that have that capacity to have perspective and identify and articulate. It's the more intellectual part of ourselves, the part of ourselves that does that. What if we lose that? And what if we go to the more essential, primitive, primordial, autonomic parts of ourselves? And when that happens and the amygdala gland takes over, for example, and the amygdala gland is just all about keeping me alive, and it will tell me, get to safety, get to safety. If there's a predator around, get out of here. And this is, it's a sad story, but it's a true story. And so I shall share it, not to frighten anybody. But during COVID, when I was alone, I had a kind of a dream, woke up and I had sort of a dream. It was a dream. So it was like I was dreaming, but it felt like I was awake. I looked out I have a lot of windows in my place because I love for the out of doors to come in. I love to watch the seasons. I love to watch the flowers growing from every window. So that was my request, my desire, my heart's desire to find a place where I could see the outdoors and be open to the outdoors. And my property abuts Cogswell Park, which is a WPA work program from the 1940s, where people who were out of work, this was thanks to Franklin Roosevelt and his administration in the United States, did all kinds of public projects and built things that would last. And so nearby, I will climb up over this hill of rock, because I live on a ridge, a rocky ridge. If I climb up over the hill of rock, I will get to Cogswell Park, which has a stone pathway all the way around it and a stone house. And it has roads built in, and it has ways of being able to walk about. And so when I first moved into here, I looked at all forest. And so I could look outside, and it was very safe and very calming. And then came lockdown. And the very first day of lockdown, what came? The property in that direction. I'm looking up at the park, but the property in that direction was a farmer's old farmhouse. And an entrepreneur bought that farmhouse with the intention of constructing on the property out my window, an apartment building. And so, as some of us would say, there's no coincidence. But here was a trauma that I faced. I felt as I walked outdoors on that day when my body was trying to comprehend, what? There's a lockdown? We're not supposed to go places? What? And I stepped outside and where I am in my office, I'm looking out at the second floor. So I heard these noises. They were offensive noises of trees being cut down. I could see the swishing, it's a death knell, swishing of a tree before it is taken down. And I felt something awful in the environment. And we've since come to see, and I don't know the name of it, you probably do, the mitochondria or whatever the connection is beneath the earth that trees have with one another, where their roots systems connect. I expect saguaro cacti have this too. I am fascinated, by the way, you're from a place where there's cactus, in particular saguaro cactus, like the southeast of the United States, New Mexico, for example. Saguaro cactus doesn't have roots that go deep as trees do. Saguaro cactus has roots that go far and wide, and so far and wide that we can't see how far they're going. But what does that do? That enables them to take down any rain that comes and to gather it from a great distance. So all of the water that's coming down and pouring down here and pouring down here is coming to the heart of the saguaro, and that's how it stays alive. And it's interesting, one time when I was in recovery as a codependent at a place called Wickenburg, Arizona, it was called the Meadows. It was primarily for people to go who had substance addictions. But fortunately, at the time, in the late 1980s, there was also insurance protection for a brief time that those of us who had codependency, which is to say we were so addicted to taking care of others before we took care of ourselves, if we ever got around to taking care of ourselves, that was a kind of disease too. That was a kind of disease too. And so I went to a session called a survivor session to look at some of the things I had dealt with as a child. And I had, as one of my older sisters had done, she had a way of coping where some survivors do, which was called dissociative amnesia. Her body, the way to keep her safe was that she forgot every minute of our childhood. She would ask me as she became ill, she would ask me, so I don't remember anything of our childhood. She would look at me with this, I don't know if I can do it. innocent child's face, because it was the innocent child's body that she left behind when she couldn't bear the abuse that was going on. And so she would say to me, I don't remember anything about it. But she would say it without feeling. It wasn't like, I'm so sad, or my God, this was awful, or I'm frightened that I forgot so much. No, it was the dissociative sense of, I don't remember anything about our past. But at the same time, she would say two things. One, tell me what happened. And two, she would say things like, it was a beautiful family. Everything was perfect. Nothing hurt at all, as Kurt Vonnegut said. Or everything, I was told I could be whatever I wanted. And I was thinking, what happened between the eldest in the family and the youngest? Because I heard the opposite. I heard abusive things. And again, I want you to protect yourself when I say something that was very painful. So I'll just make it more of a general statement. I was not encouraged to feel good about myself. I was not encouraged to think I was attractive or intelligent or special in any way. I was taught to be quiet and to keep the family secrets. And here's my older sister saying to me, oh, yes, I was told you can be anything you want to be. Oh, what? What? Was this a whole 5-year difference made that much of a difference? Because what I was taught, and I heard my sisters being told this too, become a teacher just in case anything happens to your husband and you have to go back to work. Become a teacher so that when your kids grow up and if you want to go to school and make sort of a secondary income, you can go teach. That was the message. That was the message. Some families got, you can become a nurse, you can become a teacher. Those are your two choices. But we never got, at least I never got, become whatever you want. My other sister, the middle sister, said, you know what? We were taught, this is her understanding, and she doesn't remember all of it either. I'm the one who got to remember more than anyone and got to notice more than anyone what was going on. And so my other sister's memories were, yes, things were terrible with our mother. Yes, our mother was mentally ill. Yes, she was out of control, dysregulated. Yes, she had what was euphemistically at the time called nervous breakdowns. Yes, breakdowns. Yes, she had those. But to a child, to have parents out of control is to say the universe is not right. So when my father went into one of his violent rages and became another person, he did. He dissociated and separated from his body and became this punitive God. And as a narcissist, he was a God. And so he became an all-punishing, physically abusing force. And when my mother went into her dissociative state, she split off from her body and just became insane. And I won't describe it because I haven't set up all the boundaries that I would need to do that. But it was terrifying. Either way, it was terrifying. So I have one sister, the eldest, saying everything. I don't remember anything, but it's all beautiful. And I was told I could be whatever I wanted. And then my other sister saying, oh, our father was wonderful. I remember my sister saying, and hitting her chest, he was my rock. I looked at her. This was at my father's memorial. I looked at her and I felt, wow, he was my predator. He was my violator. He was my incestor. And to her, he was my rock. I suppose a child's brain looks for safety. I know mine did. What did I do? I pictured myself outside of the unsafe place, any place within the four walls, that brick house that my father built to be a bastion. That brick would keep a home cool in the winter, in the summer, and keep it warm in the winter. That was his idea, unless the furnace went out in the winter. That was horrible. But here we were, 3 generations within one sisterhood, one family, being told different things and believing different things. I had the type of memory that said when something went wrong, it didn't feel right, like an animal inside of myself. it didn't feel right. If a tsunami was coming, I felt something's coming. I could tell when my father was parking his car or even coming up the hill to the house, I could tell what kind of shape he was in. My nerve cells were attuned to his nerve cells. Why? Because I had to know if I was going to be safe. How could an animal that doesn't see a storm out at sea but feels it, how could that animal know to climb high? How could the foolish man not know to build his house upon the sand? And the wise man knows somehow to build his house upon the rock. The wise woman, knows to go high. Michelle Obama says they go low, we go high. So the theme today is what happens when one of those tsunamis starts to come? What happens when something doesn't feel safe on the outside? What is the trauma survivor's response? Are we like cows, sheep, dogs even, who know something's going wrong? It's no wonder dogs have such a hard time with their sense of hearing and their sense of smell. They can't bear the sound, the violation to them of, it feels to them like a thunderstorm, but it's actually just firecrackers going on. And the idea is to keep dogs really safe and protected, but it's very hard if there are these clouds and puffs and booms and booms and booms going off. And to little children, once they get used to it, it's exciting because they can predict and they can see, but to traumatize little children, it might not be so safe. So my question is, what is the source, the safety source, the source of safety inside of us that takes care of us and advises us what to do when trauma comes our way? And trauma could be coming by a natural force, a force majeure, which is what lawyers call it when something outside ourselves comes to us like a tsunami or a flood. An act of God is what lawyers started calling it. An act of God, something beyond what we can foresee. Like a great flood comes our way. And that is something the law can't really take care of because it's not predictable. Some things are predictable, things that are not predictable. This force majeure, this beyond the usual force comes. Who's responsible? Because the law is always about who's got to pay whom and for what. I'm smiling because my first year contracts professor, Andy Spanicle, Buffalo, Maine, Georgetown, he was in all these different law schools, and he used to always begin his classes with contract. Who is suing whom and for what? And that's what he wanted us to engage in our brain. But his tactic also was the shaming method of driving a student until she got so far she couldn't be logical anymore. The Socratic method, just keep pushing. And the first time Andy Spanicle did that with me, and I was the first week, the second week of being a law student, and he began his Socratic method. And he kept pushing me, and it felt unsafe. I thought this force majeure was coming my way. And it was this highly developed intellect from various law schools who ended up at Georgetown Law School, which was a prize for a law professor to go to. He was extremely analytical. I don't recall him having feelings, but his intention was in the second week of law school to let us know who belonged there and who didn't. And I, as a feminist, who would want a feminist in law school? Well, today I hope people would, but back then, who would want this emotional woman who was going to stand up for her rights? And so Andy Spanicle grilled and grilled and grilled me, did not knowing I was a trauma survivor. And what happened inside of me is, as a trauma survivor, wise man, wise woman builds her house upon the rock. I went to the rock place inside of me where I could rely upon my logic because I knew that would save me. Somehow I knew if I stayed logical, that would save me. If I went emotional, I was dead. Don't most of us know if we start crying, we're vulnerable and we're dead? And I learned as a 3-year-old from that sister that forgot everything about our childhood. I learned not to show my emotion. So Andy Spanigal kept quizzing me, asking one question after another. And I just kept giving him the logical response. I set to the side any compassionate, emotional response. I just kept going with a logical response. So I remember the case. This is like 1973. We are talking almost 50 years ago, or is it 50 years ago? My brain blocks about math, but that was when it was 1973, fall 1973. And he kept pushing me, and I kept doing the next logical thing and the next logical thing. And the case was Bertha Chitsky. I used to joke about Bertha Chitsky had bit her file. Why was that? Because it was about a Drake's cake into which somehow a file had been baked, not to get somebody out of prison, but a file, at the manufacturing plant, somehow this piece of a file got baked into the cake, and Bertha Chitsky broke her tooth. And who was responsible? Bertha bought the cake. It was her problem. Wait a minute, people said. It wasn't her problem. She was an innocent person buying a cake. She bought the cake. She didn't buy the mental distress or the physical distress. Who was responsible? So this was the first case in the line of a number of cases about proximate cause. Who can be held responsible when something goes wrong? And over and over and over the years, the warranty system built up so that the manufacturer who had the money would have to pay for the Bertha Chitskys of the world who broke their tooth because the manufacturer was awry. So what did manufacturers start doing to keep their income up? They started developing warranties, which is why today we need to look at warranties, because they're limited. They don't allow us to go back and sue for everything, the mental distress, the physical distress, the physical harm. No, they have a limited amount that we can recover. And it's also the onus is on us to protect ourselves, So, for example, I just bought these $7,000 hearing aids, $7,100. Why did I buy them? Because I have hearing loss. I need to have the best. I have hereditary hearing loss from my father. That's how he didn't go to World War II. And I've got it. And so I need to have these high-tech hearing aids, and they're expensive. And what's covered? Ready for this? Because of proximate cause, and who has to pay for this stuff? It usually goes to the consumer. This corporation will pay for 3 years of a warranty on these $7,100 hearing aids. And one time, if I lose them, it will pay of that $7,100, although I'm sure depreciation would knock it down, but they have to replace it with new hearing aids, less price to them. But I have to pay a deductible of $500. So what I'm trying to say here is people who were liable were protected by the law from having to pay too much. Why? Because they were the ones that kept the American economy going, or the British economy going. Now, if I've lifted off and you're going, why is Holly Elissa going into this? We got 15 minutes left of the program. Maybe it's because Holly Elissa is a trauma survivor. It's easier for me to stay in my intellect, as I did with Andy Spanigal, when he was coming for the jugular. He was coming to let me know that I wasn't cut out for the law. That as a woman, and in 1973, the year that this happened, only women and people of color comprised 3% of the attorneys in the country. They did not need women in the law. There was a Supreme Court case that said women cannot become lawyers because our brains are focused on the finite, focused on the specific. Good for darning socks, good for doing needlepoint, good for cooking, good for taking care of children. But, all of the intricacies like changing diapers, etc., but couldn't see the big picture. And we know from Carl Jung that 70% of people on earth are that really focused, sensing type of person that sees exactly what's in front of him. Both of my parents were sensors. They were concrete, down to earth. And their most gentle way of talking about me was to say, she's got her head is in the clouds. She can't see what's in front of her. The most positive way was to call me an absent-minded professor, which they never did, but that's what I got called later, and I became a professor. What am I talking about here? According to Carl Jung, there were two archetypes. One was some people were very concrete, down to earth. They needed to learn things in a linear kind of way. And they didn't see the big picture. They didn't see interconnections. They saw what was. Those were the sensors. Then there were the 30%. I was in the 30%. 30% were intuitors. And our way of looking at the world was to ask not, what is that? What is that? What is that? But to look around and say, what is life all about? What are the connections between that? What's the connection between the rain and the flowers? What's the connection between the fact that everything shuts down in the wintertime and everything comes to life? That was the way my brain worked. And so Andy Spanigal, coming after me as a woman, assumed what was the general assumption was that women couldn't handle the big picture. But I could, because that's the way I was born. And I could perhaps because by nature, by nurture, is the only way I could survive was to try to understand what was befalling me. And then there was that Supreme Court case, which few of us that were in law school, we read the Supreme Court case out loud. We read it as a drama. Why women could not become attorneys? Because our brains were so restricting. Our brains were so restricting. So what do we do, my friends, when trauma comes our way? Do we have the sense of animals to climb high? When they go low, we go high. That was a sense of a brilliant woman, Michelle Obama. Do we have that sense? Or are we in danger? And what about a child who can't escape? Well, let me tell you right now, here is an approach that has come about recently as a lot of the work for trauma survivors focuses on, you may have heard this phrase, becoming your own loving parent. How many of you have heard that we have, it's a Schwartz, is it Richard Schwartz, who did No Bad Parts. He talks about how we have these parts within us that take care of ourselves. And then there is a book written by trauma survivors, especially those who are adult children of alcoholics. It's called The Loving Parent Guidebook. It's only one of many, many books you can use that are about becoming letting go of being the critical parent of ourselves, that voice that drives us. I used to call it Adolf, that drove us into driving ourselves to you can't be, you got to beat yourself. I had to beat myself up to be a success. It was not safe to be anything but an all A+ person. So here's one of the books, and it talks about what do we do when the trauma is coming our way? What do we do if that voice inside of us that is the fear response says, you're horrible. You don't know what to do. Get the hell out of here. Just run. It'll take care of us. Or the critical parent voice comes when we're facing a dilemma like I was with Andy Spanigal and says, you can't do this. You can't face this. You don't know how to do this. You're just going to put up your neck, put up your jugular vein, because a superior in your tribe will come and get you. I just read about wolves. You know how they always say that when wolves do that thing to see who's the alpha in the pack, it's men, male wolves, that the wolf, I always have trouble saying that, the wolf who is not the superior allegedly lies on his back, revealing his jugular vein as if to say, go ahead, bite me where I'm most vulnerable, kill me. What I just read is that the superior wolf, the alpha, who has established his alphaness, doesn't need to kill that one. One knows. One knows it's inferior. And it's the similar thing with trauma survivors. Push me far enough, I know I'm inferior. push me far enough and I will beat myself up and put myself so far down that I'm not a threat to anybody. I won't speak up to anybody. Andy Spanigal, and I'm not talking about him specifically, he's gone, the man has died. He was doing what the Socratic method told him. He was just doing his job of pushing me until I failed. The thing is, my friends, I didn't fail. I just kept going with that logical thing until I said, and I won't go through the reconstruction of it, but I said to him, no, then the logical conclusion would be, and he looked at me, and he looked at me like he looked at me as my father used to look at me. My father was a sadistic man, took pride, took joy out of putting somebody else down. Narcissists often have that. I'm not saying Andy Spanigal was a narcissist. However, I am saying that the cue to me, as he got that look on his face, I knew something had happened. And he went inside of himself, this professor, full professor of law, said, Ms. Bruner, that's what I was called at the time, Ms. Bruner has knocked the ball out of the ballpark. And I was not into knocking home runs out of the ballpark. I played softball at best. I mean, that was a guy's sport. But Ms. Bruner has knocked the ball out of the ballpark. He couldn't get me. He couldn't stop me. And so I survived that one. But for the remainder of my 3 years, I lived in a traumatized state that could happen to me any day and that I might fail. And why might I fail? Because trauma survivors build up within us a critical parent that tells us what we cannot do, that tells us how bad we are, that tells us how stupid we are. And we do that to ourselves. We don't need somebody from the outside to tell us danger's coming, to tell us we can't, we have to stay in our place. That is the message. The message is don't get a big head. That was the original voice message. But the message was don't believe in yourself. Don't speak up. Don't speak out. Just don't rock the boat, baby. No. Be silent. Be silent. Be ashamed of yourself and have no power so that the people who are in power will retain the power. And so this attempt, and then that keeps us in our place, does it not? Just as the wise animal knows to climb high, the foolish man doesn't know to climb high. The foolish man is like not seeing the threat around him. And so his house goes flat and he goes out with the tsunami. This wise man up on the rock, right? The wise animal up on the rock. So we have within us, trauma survivors, this negative force that tells us from the get-go we're wrong. I became exquisite at blaming myself, beating myself up as a child, because I felt it was safer in a way if I could show how contrite and how ashamed I was of myself. I apologize. And I've been good at apologizing for a long time because I would say I knew I was wrong. When I say that I'm wrong, in a way, not in a way, it used to be to protect myself because that was the defeat. That was the superiority that the threatening person needed to have. I was wrong. You were right. Bite my neck. As I became more adult, I changed that. I didn't automatically allow myself to be blamed. What I did instead was to take responsibility for what I'm responsible for, but I would not take responsibility for anyone else. So, as trauma survivors, we often apologize for something we haven't done. I'm so sorry that happened. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Bite my neck. Why? Because we have learned it's got to be our fault. We were at fault. If we're at fault, the narcissist is happy because we're supply to the narcissist because narcissist is never wrong. Narcissist needs people around him or her, although the majority of narcissists in the United States are male. Narcissist can't ever admit he's wrong. That would be a real mistake. You just think about some of the politicians we have. How many of them can say, I was wrong? I was wrong about that. I made a mistake. I'm going to make this right. Jimmy Carter was probably the only president of the United States that I recall. Barack Obama, too. It takes an amount of maturity. It took me an amount of time of gaining the maturity to distinguish between everything being my fault, which is bite my neck to the narcissist. Go ahead, blame me, blame myself. And maybe you won't hurt me as much. Maybe you won't have to annihilate me as much if I see that I'm always in the wrong. Now, when my father died, I changed that. And how did I change that? I changed that after getting help. The trauma survivor's help comes from finding someone who will listen to us, whom we can trust, who will believe us, who doesn't make fun of us. And so I found 10 years ago a trauma doctor, Bernard George Gray. I don't even know if he's still on earth, but Dr. Gray, who knew about trauma, and he knew not to allow me to continue to blame myself. He knew to work with me on that critical parent or that negative voice that was inside of myself, always judging myself at fault. But that's what we learn as sons and daughters of narcissists. Of course, it's all our fault. Of course, it's all my fault. So that's what I learned, to just go into the submissive state. It's a slavery state. It's a slavery state. Lots and lots of literature, thank God, on what happened with slaves. I mean, I think about the songs, the spirituals that helped guide slaves who were running to freedom. And they felt they had to run. It sure wasn't safe to walk to freedom. You had to run. Wade in the water, wade in the water. That meant we had to go through the water to get to freedom. If in a halfway house, which was then called the Underground Railroad, if there was a quilt put on the bed or on the ground where I was sleeping in safety by someone who was protecting me, I looked, and it was not in writing, it was in graphics. If I looked at the design of the quilt and it was pointing a certain way, that meant that's the way I needed to go. If it indicated something else, it told me the path to freedom. It told me the path to freedom. And so enslaved people had to keep secret how to escape. Look what happened to Moses in the rushes, right? His mother, to keep him alive, put him in the bulrushes in a bassinet that would float. And he floated up. That's how he was saved. A horrible thing for a mother to have to abandon her child. A horrible thing for a child to be abandoned to survive. And yet, that is what happens to trauma survivors. We have to abandon ourselves to survive. And so how do we, and I'm looking at the time, we've got max of 10 minutes left. How do I, as a trauma survivor, grow out and through up? Robert Frost nailed it. The best way out is through. How do I face and grow through the terrible fear that controls me, that tells me that I am the worst, and then I believe it, that tells me it's all my fault, and then I believe it, which keeps me alive in the presence of a narcissist who needs to believe that he's perfect, that he's perfect. Sadly, with my father, that's what he needed until he died. And I don't know how he dealt with his death, because he didn't want any of us there with him. Strangers, that was okay for him to have with him. But when I sat with him, he was using his narcissistic and nihilistic ways with me, even at the end, shaming me every which way, so that he could feel. I think a narcissist takes power, sticks a straw in the vulnerable, and sucks up all the energy. And so that my father attempted to do that right up until the last moment I saw him. And I said to him, no, very strongly. I said to him, no. He was doing all the things he knew to do, comparing me to my older sister, who was the sun goddess, comparing me. And that's true in an ethnic family, which turned out to be part Black. I, the dark one, could never be the hero, the one who looked like my blonde, blue-eyed mother. She was the one who was the perfect one, and never me, honestly. No, I was brown as a berry in the summertime. And I had his looks. I had his large ethnic nose, his large ethnic ears. I mean, my heritage is from Sierra Leone. My heritage is from Ghana. My heritage is from Nigeria. Do all people there have big noses and big ears? No, but my father did. And he was considered a handsome man, but he was not blonde and blue-eyed. And in the 1930 census in the United States, he was labeled, he and his family members were labeled Negro. Okay, so here's the point. I was taught to abandon myself and abuse myself so that I could feel that I was nothing, and then I would be no resistance to the power. Now, an animal has, and that's in a way, isn't it? Isn't that sad? That's in a way my, as an abused, traumatized child, that was my way to take care of myself. If death was the threat, I could save myself by abandoning myself. Go ahead, finish up this awful act against my body that you're doing, because I'm not going to be here. Go ahead. I'm not going to cry when you hit me. I'm not going to call any attention from the neighbors if they paid attention. But neighbors in those days, in the 1940s and 50s, did not pay attention. It was none of their business. If a child or a wife were being molested, it was not until 1993 in every state in the United States that spousal abuse became illegal in every state. Man's house, said the Supreme Court, was his castle. I did a study on this, my friends. I'm going into the intellect here, but I did a study to understand what justice was. And I called the course I prepared at the University of Maine, Augusta, I called it Visions of Justice. And I read everything I could about how men, because it was men at the time, were defining justice. And Rawls, R-A-W-L-S, had written this tome. I mean, it was so thick and so, I struggled my way through it to find out that his understanding of justice was, you ready for this? What's your sense of justice? I could tell you at my time, justice was a sense of equity. It's a sense of giving people, allowing people whose voices have been taken away, what a surprise, to have their voice. I'm going to let my hair down for this one. It was allowing people who were in groups, classes of people who had no voice, to have a voice. It was allowing, and in consumer law, it was allowing a consumer to sue the rich guy who had, by mistake or intention, baked the file into the cupcake. And when Bertha Chesky broke her tooth and had mental distress because she looked strange, she was allowed to get some money to repair her tooth because she was distressed. But if you keep those people who are beaten and trodden down and put in prison camps and abused until they die, I mean, look at the indigenous children in Canada, in the United States, who were sent off to religious schools to become white. My friend Jim Kickapoo tribe, sent off to Baptist Presbyterian school, shaved his head, put him in starched shirts. He could no longer speak his language. He could no longer be himself. He was taught to be a white Christian male. Look at all of that history. Many of those children died. Many of those indigenous children died. Many abused children, traumatized children died. Why? Because the essence of who we are was becoming annihilated. The message to an annihilated, traumatized child is lose every bit of your identity that you can. If you're a slave, lose that identity. Learn how to code switch. You guys know that term, right? Code switch So if I, for example, as a bourgeois child, was with people, and I was as a Girl Scout, as a Brownie Scout, I got chosen to go to the top of the hill in my very stratified town, and I could be with the wife. Her name was Mrs. Houghton. I could go into her estate because I was chosen as the outstanding Brownie Scout. And I got to go into her house, and I had to wear my white gloves, and I had to be polite, and I did all of that until I had somewhat of a sense of safety, and I started talking with her by telling the truth. And I'll never know. I blamed and she basically ushered me out of the house. Now I'll never know if it was her clock and she had devoted 15 minutes of her precious time as a privileged person to doing this thing for the community, to having this little outstanding Brownie Scout, not from a privileged part of the community, come in. And it was time for me to leave. So she escorted me out in mid-sentence. I didn't know if it was that, and I still don't know to this day, or because I felt at home in this environment of great luxury. This was the head of a multinational corporation, her house, her exquisite furniture, her exquisite artwork, her exquisite art class. I started feeling I could be myself. Did I say something that was true? Did I let my boundaries down and show myself to be who I really was? And that is what got me kicked out of there. Or was it just my time was up? Whatever it was, I left before thinking, what did I do wrong? You know, and I'm just going to say to myself in this remaining couple of minutes, maybe I didn't do anything wrong. Maybe I kept my knees together as I was taught to. Maybe I was properly dressed as I was taught. I'm sure I was. Maybe I had my white gloves on as little Brownie Scouts had to. And maybe it was just time for me to go. So, my friends, here is one methodology that trauma survivors offer trauma survivors when the tsunami's coming, when danger is coming, and when our first response is to blame ourselves or to code switch. And code switch means simply, not simply, but sophisticatedly speaking the language of the person in power so we can fit in, so we can pass. My father was labeled a Negro, and when 1930 he went off to Cornell, he code switched. What did he do? He went to the Italian tailor for whom he worked, and that tailor made him a whole suit of clothing. Wondrous. I saw that clothing was wondrous, hand stitched, the most exquisite Italian attire. Of course, it was probably too much for Cornell University. He didn't have the ways that white boys passed, but he had elegant clothing. So that was an attempt to code switch just by looking. But the way of speaking also. My father became to speak like the persons who are dominant. I learned when I lived in and taught in England. I just talked it through with guys. It was tough for them to know what my strata was because I was a professor and because they couldn't tell from the way I spoke. Well, I can tell you, as a child with Mrs. Houghton, I learned from my older sister. I learned that there was a way that I could speak that had power, where I pronounced every word properly, that I sat up straight, that I learned the gestures that went along with it, that there was a way, my friends, to code switch so I would be safe. Now, as we end, I'm going to leave you with a code switching, with a safety tactic that trauma survivors created for trauma survivors. When the critical voice inside of us is threatening to take over and we're going to say, we're going to abandon ourselves. So here's what we're supposed to do. You ready? It's called nip it in the bud. And step one, if we're starting to beat ourselves up and abandon ourselves and letting that critical voice tell us we're nothing. Do you know what I'm talking about? Number one, nip it in the bud. Notice when that critical parent, that voice telling us we're bad, we're wrong, it's all about us being evil, arrives on the scene. And when that happens, do something physical. Breathe in, breathe out. I do tapping of the acupuncture spots, tapping into the power places where the nerve cells join up in my body. Tap. So notice it coming. Notice I'm starting to feel diminished. Number 2, I nip, and notice I identify the exact nature of the attack. What is threatening me? What is threatening me? Am I judging myself? Am I blaming myself from the inside? Is an awful voice inside of me yelling at me? Is someone from the outside calling me names? And is that triggering from the inside all the names that I was called? And so I need to identify or label, what is the trigger? Identify the trigger. Is someone just looking at me like condescendingly? Is a male looking at me lasciviously, like I'm bait? Is a narcissist looking at me like, I'm going to love bomb you, but then I'm going to put you down. I'm going to stick my venom in you, and then you're going to be in my web, and I can come over and suck your blood whenever I need to. Okay, and the third thing is, so the first thing is to notice that something's happening, that's a threat. The second thing is to identify it. Identify the trigger. What's triggering me? Why? So that I can see that the trigger is not the original trigger that was going to kill me, but it's something that reminds me of the original trigger. Okay. So if someone's yelling, that doesn't mean he's yelling at me. That doesn't mean I'm going to be hit next. That doesn't mean I'm going to block out. I'm going to go have a blackout next from being hit. And the third thing of nip it in the bud, and we'll end with this, is parent. The P stands for parent yourself. So you're going to notice, I'm going to notice what's going on. I'm going to identify what the trigger is. And then I'm going to step in with my prefrontal cortex, with my executive function, and I'm going to parent myself by replacing that distorted message, the trigger from the past, with a loving parent message. And what does that mean? I'm going to say to myself, sweetie, he's not yelling at you. Or if he is yelling, he's angry at himself. Don't quit taking it personally. Q-tip. I have all kinds of ways that I've learned over the decades not to take things personally. So I'll close, my friends. Next week, we'll go on with another piece of this, but I'll close about what happens when we abandon ourselves as trauma survivors. How can I become that wise animal who climbs the hill in the case of the tsunami? How can I become the wise person who builds her house upon the rock and not upon the sand? So when the threat and the trigger comes, my house doesn't come tumbling down. I have loved being with you. Thank you so much. I invite you as we end to ask yourself, how have you learned to no longer abandon yourself? Thank you so much. If you need to call a warm line to talk this through with someone, if something's been triggered in you, you can look up trauma warm lines. They're all over the United States or in adjacent states. You can call and not be judged and talk through what you need. So, my friends, I shall say goodbye, and I will see you next week. Thank you so much.